I am so excited that we are into season 3 of my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. When I first began this podcast, I had no idea that it would take off. I began it because I genuinely want more people to listen, reflect, and learn about how our life experiences can influence us in ways that we cannot begin to imagine. Due to the wonderful candid stories my speakers have shared, I now know that my podcast is ranked in the top 5% globally. I want to thank all my speakers for this huge achievement. As always, if you enjoy it, please do share, rate, and review. Thank you for listening. This is a story of particular resilience. Jude Hughes was born in Dublin in 1941 to an unmarried Irish woman and a black man. His father, he would initially be told, was from Trinidad. He spent his early life in St. Patrick's Mother and Baby Home. The rest of Jude's childhood was spent in institutions, first in a convent, later in an industrial school where he also learned a trade. Growing up in Ireland, he rarely saw another black person. At 16, Jude trained as a tailor and went to work in Dublin. Linked to Jude's story is the release on Tuesday, 12th January 2021 of the Mother and Babies Homes Commission, which shared a 3,000-page report with survivors of the system of religious institutions in Ireland. These institutions housed women and girls who became pregnant outside marriage. Most relevant to Jude is the policy of the religious organizations and the state of impeding him from tracing his parents, or as Jude says, being told that the information was redacted. Ireland denies adopted people the legal right to their own information in files. The report is understood to chronicle many of the lies and obfuscations of priests, nuns, and officials. Thank you so much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias with me, Jude.
You're welcome. Delighted to be able to speak to you.
Jude, to start with, could you explain to us what it's like growing up in an institution?
As most people know, when you grow up in institutions, when you reach the age of 16, you leave it. And usually you might be trained in a trade and all that, and you then out in the wide world. Now, that's grand to a certain extent if everything goes well. You might have a lodgings, or you might stay in a hostel until you get a position where you can go on the normal full board. Eventually you leave the hostels and go into these situations. But at the same time, you're aware that you have to keep working because you cannot go back to these institutions if anything goes wrong. So you realize very quickly that you're on your own and you just gotta survive. And as I say, you either sink or swim. Now, that's grand for most people who have families. If they don't like a job, they can run back home. But when you've nobody to go fall back on, nobody, no safety net, you have to put up with a lot of situations that you wouldn't put up with normally. But you put with them because you have to survive.
Right. So that's really quite moving, Jude, and thank you for sharing that. Because you're so right. For those of us who have the privilege of family, we can make decisions without worrying about it because we have a safety net, as you so correctly said. But were you the only one? Were there? I mean, there would have been many of you in that children's home and in the institution. And
Yes,
I'm just trying to get an understanding.
There was as many Caucasian people in these places, but they would find it easier to get another job. You got to remember, black people couldn't walk into jobs that easy, even back then in Ireland, because they just didn't know how to deal with a black person in the first place. And you were aware of that. And, you know, you keep being asked, where are you from? And then when you say you were born here, they'd say, where are you really from? The only people of my color were from Africa, students who were studying medicine and law. That was the only people who were normally here back then. And so you could understand there were very few actual black people working outside of medicine and law. And those who were there were only studied medicine. And while they were doing their medicine, they attended some of the hospitals here as part of their training and all that. Otherwise, there was very few working permanently.
Right. So what would that then mean in terms of how people perceived you? Because I first understood one aspect of your unconscious bias, which is the whole idea because of your 0 to 16, growing up in an institution and in an industrial school with zero family, you knew that you had to sink or swim. And I think you mentioned
I
to me
knew,
that many of your
I
friends were not the same. Some of
yeah,
them were not able to swim, they began to sink. So, what
yes.
was it within you and your unconscious bias that helped you manage that?
Well, when you could leave these institutions, people forget something that they don't think of at the time. You enjoy the new freedom. You're able to go to the shows. You're able to stay out late in the evening, which you never did when you were in institution. So, but that loses its grandeur as you go along, and then eventually it dawns on you. You've nobody, you've no friends, you've no this, you've no that, because you're in a whole new open world that you hardly know anybody. So you then, in my area, I used to play basketball and play music. So I ended up joining a basketball club. I ended up in a band. Now, I think that was important to me because it kept me occupied after I finished work and I had some sideline activities. Now, if you didn't develop those, you'd be going home to your flat and you'd find yourself very lonely, very bored. As you can understand, at 16, you miss the company of people and all that. So that helped me a bit in being involved in the music and in the band, in the sports. So
Right.
there was how I started going in within a few months of getting back up to Dublin. And that was lucky. And in fact, I joined the band more by accident. I saw this band marching and they stopped where I was listening to them and I was whistling the tune. And this fella, when they finished playing, they dismissed and he came over to me and he said to me, "Well, tell me the name of that tune." And I told him what the name was. And he said to me, you've played music. I said, I did. This is where we practice on a Thursday evening and a Sunday morning. You're welcome to join us.
How
That's
wonderful.
how easy I got into that band. In fact, it was the way he had spotted me. He was a bass player, and I was on the pad, just tapping my feet, whistling it because I knew the tune because we played it when I was in the band, the school band, and he had spotted me and
That was
realized,
very lucky.
and that's how I ended up in the band.
Such a fun story. And
Yeah,
and actually, obviously, the seriousness of it is that you had basketball and you had music to give you a focus outside of work.
yeah. Well,
Because in the context of what we're saying, which is stories of unconscious bias, is this whole idea of being alone. And certainly during the pandemic, I'm sure there are many people who do not have your experiences who will know what it feels like to be completely alone and how do we challenge the demons in our head when we are alone. And so you were lucky. But let's just fast forward a little bit because you also mentioned that you started meeting other people who looked like you, but they were all highly educated people, lawyers and doctors and so on, who had come from Africa.
oh
So,
yes.
what was that about in terms of
Oh,
your
it
unconscious
was great.
bias?
Let's say we'd be passing on the street and they'd look at you and they'd give you a nod as if to say, "Hello, brother." And eventually one or two would stop and chat to me because they were curious. And they'd say, where are you from? And then I tell them I was born here and they say, "Oh, I didn't know there was anyone like you born here." And I got to know a few that way. And it was nice. And they'd call me brother. hello, brother.
And
That seems,
for that who has no immediate family, that word brother means a lot, doesn't it? It means far more than it does to others, I'm sure.
well, it. I learned very fast that Africans, if they're any way greet you, they would nearly say hello, brother, or even the girls would say hello, sister. Just as a friendly gesture. You know.
Which is actually very heartwarming for someone who is completely alone and
Well,
who has
you
no immediate
I,
family.
you wouldn't get too many whites saying to me, hello, brother.
Mhm. But then can we continue with this, Jude? So
Yeah.
so you are now what? How old are you, and what kind of experiences are you having? You've learned to swim, or you are
Well,
learning to swim rather than
yeah.
sink, and now what?
Well, I kept at the tail and I went to night school as well to obtain textiles. So I did all that at night as well. That was the other part of me. So it was pretty full between night school, where I was working at the tailoring apprentice where I worked, and then night school a few nights a week, and the band and the basketball. And I tell you, I was pretty full up with activities. Then, then, as you know, in the 60s, now that was what I often say, the 60s was brilliant time. It was a new awakening becoming in the world. Uh, to explain this to people, the amount of African countries were demanding their freedom, the civil rights were beginning to get going, the anti-nuclear, anti-war, and so there was a lovely, as the Bob Dylan song says, the times they are a changing. Now
Yes.
the young generation around the world were now starting to say, wake up and say, we're not going to accept what our fathers accepted. And if you study, let's say, the 60s, you notice everything started changing in those 10 years. There was a new awakening. The likes of President Kennedy being elected, he was a fresh young guy, very go ahead. You had all the African countries beginning to get their freedoms all over the place. You had even the French students demanding that Algeria be given back and all that stuff as well. And there was that few freshness. And then you had then the civil rights uh, who began to also demand. I mean, they were always demanding, but they got nowhere. But in the 60s, they've said enough is enough. And the anti-apartheid as well came in,
So what did
started.
that do for you? Because you were now in your 20s in
Well,
terms of age. And
yeah,
so, but you are still in a
well,
predominantly white Irish,
yeah.
island. So how does that affect you personally and your unconscious
Well,
biases?
well, as I said, you couldn't grow up and not be aware all these things happening around you, and you had to learn more. And sometimes because of where I was educated, you weren't aware of unbelievable things that were in these countries, laws that told someone, "Oh, because you're black, you're not fit to sit beside me, or you're not fit to go into this restaurant," and you couldn't believe human beings made laws like this, and at the same time talk about uh, talk about dignity and the rights of people, and talk about law. Now, I couldn't believe people could make laws that they would never accept themselves, and they expected others to accept those laws. To me, it just didn't uh, collage together. And then they would talk about God as if butter wouldn't melt in their mouth and still have these laws. And I couldn't understand how judges, doctors, police accepted this as normal. And then when people decided to do what they call peaceful protests, in fact, they based a lot of their ideas on Gandhi's peaceful protest. They then marched in around in different places, and they were beaten as if they were criminals. And literally, lots of them seriously injured. Some of them died just because they wanted the basic civil human rights that anybody else enjoyed. I could
But then
never
what does that do for you,
comprehend.
though? Because I'm trying to I'm trying to
Oh,
figure out
it,
your unconscious biases and how does that influence you? What is it that makes you who
well,
you are today? You know, you're in your
well,
20s. The world
yeah.
over, there are these things going on, which was,
And
you say it was wonderful, but why are you saying that? I mean, I really
it
want to
was
understand it.
it was wonderful because the young generation, even the white young generation, were saying to me and everyone else, this is wrong. The students started in the universities were voting against this. The students in America, and slowly they came more and more
But
as
so is that what is happening to you, Jude? Because I want to come back to you rather than to the rest of the world that's suffering
yeah.
what they are. What's happening
Well,
to you?
well,
What are your stories?
that made me conscious that everything you thought about, like when I was young, I was petted on the head, lovely, got sweets, and you thought, God, isn't it great? They love black people. But you soon learned when you grew up, they don't. And it's a different story. And you often wondered, do they think like that about you here? That behind it all, did he? But to give credit where credit is due, not everybody thinks like that. I've also been lucky to have met lovely families, and especially one or two families. And I remember, the way you say, come up to Christmas. Now, when you're on your own in Christmas in Ireland, it could be very desolate. But this family had been introduced to me by a nun, and they made sure I was up in their place every Christmas. And I went like that for over 25 to 30 years. Now, they were the lovely sides of it as well, that even though they didn't adopt me, I was almost like part of their family. And they were the nice things about it. But you could imagine people who left institutions that nobody invited. You could imagine how desolate it was for them, and especially at Christmas.
So
Nobody
what is
to
it about you then? Because I'm so appreciative of your sharing these stories, but I'm also beginning to realize that this is your unconscious bias, your stories that make you who you are. It's your narrative. Now, many other young children in the same institution at the same time would not have been invited to a family for Christmas for 25 years and almost adopted, but you were. So there's something about you and your manner and how you communicate with the world that made you more included in these stories, in these families. That's what I'm understanding.
well, first of all, you're living in this country. You have to fit in. I mean, whether you like it or not, you whether you come from abroad or rare in the country. When you grow up, you fit in. You do what you do. You get involved in what your interests are, and join them. Like as I said, the sports and the music, and the night school at night. Now, not everybody would think like that, but quite a few did go like that, and they succeeded. But there was others, they wouldn't even have got that far. And I often thought, in fact, I talked to some of my ex-school friends, and they've said to me they found it very, very lonely, and they found it effective. Now, some of them joined the army because they were so used to being institutionalized. Now these were my white friends, but they said they couldn't stick it in the outside of that, and it did help them. But I wouldn't join any army anyway. But you could see some of them went into the army, and some of them ended up joining the British Army even. But they were so used to being institutionalized, and that were their only friends they could make. It was a sad situation. I think it was a pity this a social welfare group didn't check out these people after they left the institution, because this was tough even on the white people, not just black. I mean,
Sure.
being black was like a little extra problem. But I've been pretty lucky. I didn't let it beat me, but it did affect even white people seriously, and I felt very sorry for the way it affected them. And
It's actually it's a huge learning for all of us because
yeah,
we take so much for granted, Jude. The idea of family, the idea of something to fall back on. Most of us take that for granted. But of course, there are many of us who don't have those experiences, and that's why I think it's important to hear your stories so that we can all learn from that, and we can all
And then I
appreciate it.
and then I met other uh, black people who were in institutions from other places gradually, and I chatted to them, and they felt the same. But a lot of them then left the country and went to England because they couldn't stick it here, because they felt they were being picked on and abused because of the colour. And quite a lot of the mixed race people ended up in England. Now, some of them were being bullied while they were kids in school. So this is now outside of school and also from the institution. And they found they were just being treated very bad and they just couldn't take it. So they just went to and went over to England, where they felt because there was more people from the Caribbean and Africa there, they'd fit in better, because they felt isolated terribly here.
Right. And so let's just come back to you, Jude, and your unconscious bias stories. So, you have chosen not to, like many of your friends, leave the country. You've stayed on in the country of your birth, but you have no sense of, and these are my words, no sense of identity. Certainly, when you're
I, ne-
growing up,
I,
what
I,
does that
nearly,
look?
I nearly did leave the country.
Right.
And in fact, that's a very funny story, even.
Oh yeah.
You know, London Transport, they used to advertise in the Irish papers for bus drivers and conductors. And I said, we'll try that. Now, my plan was use that until I looked around, maybe around Savile Row in London, and see where I could fit in, you know. But in the meantime, I knew I couldn't just go over to London. So I said, this be a soft job I can get until I feel my way around and then see where I can fit into some handcraft tailor over in Savile Row. And anyway, I went for the interview, got it, went through the sums and multiplications. That was not. But then I then told, right, go in, you gone through, next one, go into this lady. And this lady says to me, oh, see, Jude, you're a tailor, yeah. And then she looked at the suit I had on me and she said, did you make that? And I was proud as punch said, yes, I made that suit. And you know what she said to me? You don't want to be a bus driver or a bus conductor. She says to me, you want to use this place just to get in so that you can eventually go to Savile Row. I couldn't believe she had psyched me down to a T. Now, you know the way you dress up for interviews? If I went in as a tramp, I would have got the job.
There's a story of unconscious bias.
There was a class case where dressing up was the biggest mistake I made.
Delightful. Right. But so you didn't take the London transport job, you didn't get it,
No,
and you stayed on in Dublin and
she,
continued, and you
she,
have a successful tailoring business.
she,
I know that.
she,
But so to come back to you, because I really
yeah.
want to explore a little bit about the sense of identity, because lost identity, you've said more than once, people would say, where are you from? Now, if somebody asked me, where are you from? I'm able to answer that question because I know where I'm from. I know who my parents are. I know where I was brought up. So it's easy to answer that.
Yeah.
Whereas you're
Now,
not able to
yeah,
answer that. So what
yeah,
does that mean in terms of your identity
yeah,
and unconscious
yeah,
bias?
yeah. The problem was, naturally, after 16, you're right. You try to do some search and find out a bit more about yourself. And you get this birth certificate. And you just maybe just have your mother's name and know not even where she's from. Just say Carlo. In my case, it was Carlo, but no name of exactly what place in Carlo. And you'd ask and ask, is there any more than this? And say, that's all we have. And I've had people who even tried back then, and they just said, this is all they're giving us. Now, I found I couldn't do anything then. You've got to remember, there was no DNA back then, or no anything. So you just had to accept the information you were given. And then you also at that time I was told by other people in who were in the, oh, I met your mother, and she said your father was from Trinidad, and I just accepted that, but I'd no proof, but there was nothing I could go on. I'd no paper or no anything. So to a certain extent, because at that stage I couldn't do much as they do as now today. They can't get away with that anymore. But back then, hundreds, even the Caucasian people, they were done, and then there were some places where the information was redacted. And sometimes you'd go up and say, oh, we can't give you this under Act this or Act that. And all this was going on, but you didn't know how to get around that. So I accepted the situation. And, at the same time, you couldn't let it get you because you had to get on with the rest of your life. Well, it would have been nice, but you just accepted it at the time. And you just put it in the back of your mind and get on with surviving and get on with all your activities. And you never lost sight of that in the long run, but you just had to wait till you found a time you could focus more on that. I did in the latter years, but not back then.
So could you share with us, Jude, because, how are you, you are now 79 years old. You are still searching and trying to get more information on your parents. But
I,
what
I,
kind of lessons can we learn from you on how you have managed your
well,
successes in your life and being happy with yourself?
yeah, well, as I said, naturally, it hit you a few times during your life. Let's say now you're getting married. You've no relations to call on to come to your wedding. You're aware of that at the time. Then when you're firstborn kid, you've nobody to ring up and tell your aunts, uncles, or anybody, because you've nobody to ring up. So you have plenty of friends and that are there, which is great, you know. But you could always feel the other person had all the wives, uncles, aunts to ring up and let everyone know, whereas I'd know none of that to ring up. Now, I know that would get to be, I thought about it, but I didn't let it get under my skin. Because you can get, if you allowed things like that to get under your skin, you'd be seriously affected. And I wouldn't let it affect me because I still knew I had to survive and get on with my life.
So what is it that you do? Because the thing is, with something as big as this, Jude, you have managed to not allow it to get under your skin. Yet the world over, the listeners will be hearing your story, and they will know of many a time that we have allowed things to get under our skin, which is not even half as big as what you have gone through. So how can you advise us? How do we manage not to get it under our skin? What's the trick, if there is one?
You learn what your priorities are first in life. Get on with your life, survive, do the best you can. And the other things, while it's not essential, but they come secondary in life. And as long as you don't, if you start insisting, oh, I must have all this before the others, I found people and they were seriously affected by all this. But I did say to them, they asked me how to do, and I said, look, you got to get on the rest of your life. You can't let that hold you up and stutter your life, you know? And I know it's not easy to say that because everybody loves to have information of their background. And as you say, it was like I had what they called a lost identity, which I couldn't prove. But slowly today, I now can fill up the full tree line. I'm coming very close to the end of the African connection, and I've already filled up the mother side of it as well.
That's very heartening to hear. That's just
That
great.
that started with DNA about 2 years ago, and with some great people helping me in it. And then slowly we got names and addresses of my mother. We were able to track down exactly where she was in Carlow. And once we got a place in Carlow, the doors opened, and suddenly I was able to get more and more and more, and it was great. And that's the mother side is literally finished. We're now on the nearly a final run-in to the African connection, which is now Nigeria.
Right.
And
not Trinidad at all.
No, that was the other thing. See, you went on what you were fed, and you never questioned it back then, because I'd nothing, but I'd never had any papers to prove that. And I went around thinking I was part of the Caribbean. I even remember linking up with some of the Trinidadians at their festivals, and they used to have a steel band, and I used to call Alfred and them, and used to have great fun messing around with their steel drums and all that. Once I found out there was the other connection, I knew then this was another bit of misinformation I had been going on. Although I have nothing against the Caribbean. I love the Caribbean as well.
But it is about who you are, yes.
But now I'm focusing on my African identity.
That's great.
It's developing into a fascinating story. And I'd say in another year's time, I could come to the end of it. And
in another year's time, I might call you and have part 2 of this story of unconscious bias. But so far, it has been amazing to hear your stories, Jude. To hear the fact that you prioritize, you focus on what needs to be done rather than all the extra bits, and that's how you have managed. And I think that's a life lesson for all of us to understand and to take away. And I really appreciate you sharing your stories. Jude Hughes, thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Bye.
It has been such a privilege to hear from Jude. His genuine positive attitude towards life, his instinctive resilience, his belief in the essential goodness of people. There is so much more to Jude's story that we have not discussed. In the 1980s, Jude became a founding member of one of the first anti-racism groups in Ireland, the Association of Mixed Race Irish, AMRI, supported by Mary Robinson. The AMRI lobbied the government to examine the specific experiences of mixed-race people. Alongside their common experiences of racism and being cut off from their mixed-race identity, they asked for details about why it appears that mixed-race children were less likely to be adopted and more likely to be transferred to other institutions. In 2015, Jude Hughes won the Africa Day Award for sending out sewing machines and teaching in Rwanda and Zambia. In 2018, the Irish Times made a short award-winning film on Jude Hughes. For most of his life, Jude has not known anything about either of his parents. DNA testing suggests that Jude's ancestors on his father's side is from the Ogun state in Nigeria. Now, aged 79, Jude is continuing the search to find out more about his lost identity. Please do leave a rating and review and share this episode. It really does help others find the show. And if you have recommendations for new interviews, please contact me via Twitter or Instagram at Smita Tharoor. My next interview is on Saturday, 23rd January. Thank you so much for listening.